for the former Yugoslavia is now in session. Le Audience Tribunal Penal International pour l'ex-Yougoslavie est ouverte. Please be seated. Yes, Mr. Vice.
Honours, yesterday, in relation to the earlier part of the history, generally the Croatian indictment and part of the Bosnian indictment, I set out the range of links that may be shown connecting this accused to the various crimes with which he is charged. And shortly I'm going to return, although I hope in swifter form this morning, or in a swifter manner this morning, to those links that exist in relation to the Bosnian indictment. But it may just be useful to pause for a couple of minutes and to take stock of where we are. The court will remember yesterday, in relation to the Croatian indictment, if we could just put that on the overhead projector again, that I made the point that the declared independent areas that are shown there, except they're not coming up on my screen at the moment. Are they on your honour's screen?
Yes. Yes.
I can proceed without them. But in relation to the declared areas shown there, they would not have been doing what they did simply to achieve independence, unless there was something else to be joined to. We pause to observe that if any area, such as any one of these, simply fearful of a state it distrusted, chose to seek to protect itself, well, there could be no complaint of that. For example, I suppose, if, when we look forward, if the Kosovo Albanians concerned about a state they found threatening simply protected themselves without any insurgency that might give rise to inquiries by the Office of the Prosecutor, for example, then there could be no complaint about that. But going back to Croatia, it wasn't a case simply of seeking to establish independence. It was absolutely a case of seeking to be joined to something else, namely to Serbia. And if we just look and remind ourselves that there's a gap between Western Slavonia and Eastern Slavonia, the evidence will probably reveal to the Chamber that there would have been a desire and effort to take that area as well, but that it was impossible. But more significantly, what about Eastern Slavonia? Was this an area of Serb population majority? No, it wasn't. The reverse. It was an area where they were in a minority. And yet it was an area that was cleansed. Can we now turn to the map in relation to Bosnia and look at it in just a little bit more detail? I'll leave it on the video. Yes. Can I just look at my video? Oh, here it is. It's coming up now. The various marks that Your Honour can see, surrounded in red or blue, indicate the municipalities as declared. The legend at the bottom tells us that. And the Chamber will see that those declared municipalities do not include all the areas to the east that adjoin Serbia. And yet, the Chamber will see that it is those eastern areas that were subject to the most, sometimes the most extreme forms of ethnic cleansing and violence. In both the case of the eastern parts of Bosnia and the eastern parts of Croatia, when in due course it's possible to analyze from the evidence the degree to which the crimes, and in our respectful submission, there's going to be no doubt but that the most serious crimes were committed. When one looks to see to what degree the crimes were committed by the JNA, as opposed to being committed by, in the case of Croatia, those who represented the declared municipalities, in relation to Bosnia, the Army of the Republic of Srpska, we will find that there was a heavy preponderance of military crime being committed coming from the east, coming from Serbia, whether in the name of the JNA or the JV or whatever, coming from the east. These...
Let me see if I've got the point. Eastern Slavonia, you make the point there was not a Serb majority. But are you making a similar point in relation to Bosnia?
Certainly.
Or is it a different point?
No, it's the same point, but it's even more powerful.
Which are the areas without the Serb majority?
Can I take the... I'll hand it back. My machine isn't working. If you run down, if you look at the right-hand side of the map, you'll see that areas of Zvornik, Bratunac, Srebrenica and Visegrad are not included as the Serbian autonomous districts or regions defined by proclamation on the 21st of November. But as you, and let me explain the map a little more. The areas surrounded in blue or red are, as the legend reveals, the proclaimed Serbian autonomous districts. The areas shaded in grey are those that feature in the indictment. So that these areas, Zvornik, Bratunac, Srebrenica and Visegrad, not declared on the 21st of November, no Serb majorities, subject of ethnic cleansing and other dreadful crimes, as we've already heard. And the evidence will show in both this case and also again in the case of Croatia that the eastern regions were subject of a high percentage of direct military involvement coming from the east, from Serbia. Thank you very much. And the point is perhaps obvious, but in our respectful submission, powerful. These regions in both states, Croatia and Bosnia, declaring their autonomy or independence, weren't just doing it for themselves, they were doing it in order to be joined to something else. Was it purely fortuitous that they wanted to be joined to something that was going to be headed by this accused? Or was he, as we say, for all the reasons already advanced, a party to precisely that plan? The facts that I have just summarized, of course, indicate powerfully that of course he was a party to that plan. We heard yesterday of somebody saying that he would become their leader in the event of joinder. Of course he would. Whether in the room where things were discussed, it was a question of do this, or here's a problem, leaving its resolution to the others tacitly agreeing it, whether it was a question of others bringing a plan and his approving it, matters not, for criminal culpability would always follow. But the events, and of course his failure ever to stop the events, show that culpability there was. We've rather assumed, I can just put this, and perhaps unhelpfully to some of those watching, we've rather assumed that everybody knows the map of Yugoslavia from working in this place. We haven't actually put one on the overhead projector, and perhaps at some stage we ought to do so, although the overhead projector isn't the best vehicle really for seeing maps. But can I just borrow the thing? Thank you very much. If I can move the microphone. For those who are less familiar, what I'm saying is that the areas here, whoops, not very good, are the areas subject of this particular concern by the accused, we would say, and others. The consequence of success in these areas and joining up Slavonia with West Slavonia, the consequences of success in Bosnia would be, of course, to create an enormous area joined up and going round under Serb control. Your Honour, with that recap of yesterday's position, can I return to where we were, but as I've indicated, having given the accused an opportunity to know the categories of material, the natures of connections upon which we rely, I will now attempt to move more swiftly. We ended yesterday with the listed connections between the army of the Republic of Srpska and Serbia itself. It's necessary to mention one or two other personalities, but very briefly, some of them will recur elsewhere. Jovica Stanisic was a man who was a close associate of this accused, one of his closest, a man responsible for establishing special operations units which became known as the Red Berets. He's a man whom we must have in mind. He's a man who features not only at this early stage, but who features significantly in Kosovo when we find, so far as he is concerned, something of a change of mind. He, Stanisic, founder of the Red Berets, had very close contacts with this accused. Another man, Frankiz Simatovic, referred to as chief of the unit that was initially known as something else and then came to be known as the Red Berets, a man who would often brag to his men of a direct line of communication that he had with this accused through the previously mentioned Jovica Stanisic. I think we've got a picture of somebody wearing a Red Beret. Next, we just put on that to show what the Red Berets look like. This isn't anybody in particular. It is to him, of course, but it's a Red Beret uniform. The man Simatovic supplied Arkan and with ammunition and supplies and had a close relationship with Arkan until 1994, when Arkan's Tigers were incorporated into the ranks of the Red Berets. Further connections to this accused. Simatovic used the Red Berets to help distribute weapons in both Croatia and Bosnia. And putting the Red Berets and Perisic together very briefly, there was a time when Perisic was commander in Mostar, and he initially may have objected to the Red Berets being there because they took orders directly from Belgrade. He was overruled on that eventually. I'm not going to say more about Arkan. I dealt with him at some length yesterday. Safe to say that on one occasion, when Arkan was engaged in training some trainees, he was overheard by a witness who will be before you to say this: "Those who will not cut throats, kill, maim, and eliminate all those who dare to stand against the Serb state will be killed." And in light of the general conduct of that man, that will be evidenced, it may be thought a genuine protestation rather than mere bravado. I've already dealt briefly with the Serbian Ministry of Defense. 233. I say very little more about it at the moment, save to say this, that the accused was instrumental in passing or having passed a Serbian law on defense on the 18th of July 1991, which placed the police and the territorial defense under his personal control. And I think we've now got Article 39 of the order that dealt with that. It reads as follows: "In times of war or an immediate threat of war and in emergency situations, the territorial defense may be reinforced with volunteers too." Significance of that may become apparent a little later. Arkan had dealings with the Ministry of Defense as established by this accused, further connections. The accused himself had very regular contacts with that ministry and daily contact with the man, General Simovic, who was its head for a time. The Bosnian MUP, another body of which you'll become aware in the evidence, established early in 1992 when the authority of the Republican MUP was abolished. There's another intercept, which you will hear of in due course, or you'll hear in due course, between Karadzic and this accused, where Karadzic told the accused this: "The Muslims were simply heading towards division of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will carry out the establishment of regions and set up our MUPs wherever we are in power." It will not be possible in our submission for this accused to say that silence is anything less than involved participation when these material and important telephone intercepts become evidence in the case. For the MUP played a leading role in the takeover of municipalities and in the persecution of the non-Serb population. Another key to the takeover of Bosnia was the arming of local Serbs, something, again, that we'll find repeated in Kosovo, showing a constancy of behavior. Thus, then, several more connections beyond those that I referred to yesterday. As to the crime, or crime base, as we refer to it in these trials, in Bosnia, it wasn't anything other than a takeover of towns. It was not a conflict. It was a takeover of towns and municipalities. How was it done? Well, maybe a good illustration is to be found in what was said by somebody, a party member from Bosanska Krupa, regarding the takeover of that town, a speech or contribution to the 16th Assembly of the Bosnian Serb Assembly, where Mr. Vještica made these remarks, informing his audience of the situation in the theatre of war in the municipality of Bosanski Krupa. What have we done, he said, in this municipality? I must tell you to remind you that all there is, only 24% of Serbs in the Serbian municipality of Bosanska Krupa. That is 14,500 of us, and there are 47,000 Muslims. For a year and a half, we have been preparing for the war in the Serbian municipality of Bosanska Krupa, so indicating preparation back to the beginning of 1991. I ask a question now, he went on, which I have the right to ask. How could it happen that two-thirds of the town were taken in 2 days of operation? On the right bank of the Una River, there are no more Muslims. In the Serbian municipality of Bosanska Krupa, all the enclaves that were Rapusha, and he lists them, we have evacuated them so that there will be none there for the duration of war operations. Will they have a place to return to? I think it's unlikely, after our President told us the happy news that the right bank of the Una River was the border. Well, how was it possible to take over a municipality when they were outnumbered 3-1? Because arms had been distributed to the Serb population, because there had been extensive party leadership in the planning, and of course because of the military action supported from elsewhere that was available to them. Let's turn to Bijeljina. We've seen where it is in the northeast of Bosnia. 60% Serb, 31% Muslim. Prior to the conflict, although 70% of Bijeljina town was itself Muslim. So this is in the autonomous region as declared Semberia. One of the first targets, it would appear, of those masterminding this operation, and it was Arkan who made perhaps his reputation there. He'd been seen in the town frequently enough, familiarizing himself with the streets before the attack, an attack which involved the JNA as well as Arkan's men. The JNA which had helped distribute arms in advance to local Serbs. The JNA which provided no protection for the town when Arkan attacked. It did free some of Arkan's men when they were trapped by Muslims. And when Arkan had finished, the JNA moved in to secure the town. A former policeman from this town will describe seeing Arkan there, as well as seeing others, including Mrs. Plavsic and a man called Fikret Abdic. Plavsic and Arkan met on plainly familiar terms, and the witness was given the responsibility of collecting bodies. As a former policeman, he had some experience in the investigation of crimes, and the corpses scattered around the town had for the most part died from gunshot wounds in the mouth, temple, or back of the head, none of them wearing uniforms, and their number including women and children. Coming down the Drina River, and now to one of those places I referred to earlier, Zvornik, attacked without any provocation by the JNA, as well as paramilitaries, shelled from positions within Serbia proper, the subject of the attentions of Arkan as well. Kozluk, I don't think we have marked, an entire community of Muslims from there, 1,800 in all, gathered up in the Kozluk settlement of Visegrad. And of course, the court will remember how I described one part of this event as my opening passage at Your Honour's Court. But what was interesting was perhaps the ending of Visegrad, shown in part on the photograph on the Elmo. Those moved were forced to sign over their property to local Serb leaders and then board buses for Serbia. What happened to them in Serbia? Well, they were kept in a train yard for several days while they were given Serbian passports. With the Serbian passports, they were then transported over the Serbian border into Hungary and Austria. Whose involvement and at what level of authority does that reveal? Bratunat, again to the east, again not within one of the declared autonomous districts. 64% Muslim, 34% Serb. Again, the local Serbs had been armed in advance by the JNA. Indeed, the JNA went further, as they did elsewhere, arm the Serbs and disarm the others. In late 1991, the JNA started installing artillery weapons and mortars into positions facing the town. I go back to my earlier observations this morning. Is this the justified protection by a community of itself? Or is it entirely the reverse, as this accused well knows? In April, tanks were deployed on the Serbian side of the river with their cannons facing the town. And the takeover began when the JNA Novi Sad Corps moved in on the 16th of April, together with Arkan's Tigers and two of the other groups to which we've referred, White Eagles and Sheshel's men, most of them wearing balaclavas. Well, as I said yesterday, we keep ourselves detached, but it is perhaps worth thinking what it must feel like to be in a town, to face that sort of occupation with consequences that can have been only too easily forecast by the victims to be. On the 9th of May, in the Glogova area of Bratunat, south of Zvornik and along the Drina River, 65 Bosnian Muslim and Bosnian Croat civilians were killed by members of that first Novi Sad Corps acting with paramilitaries. 8,000 people were expelled from the municipality. And in January of '93, 6 months after the JNA allegedly withdrew from Bratunat, they returned to assist Bosnian Serbs when they were in danger of losing the municipality again. And when they got involved on this occasion, it was with tanks and rocket launchers, companies of specialized troops. General Mandic of the Yugoslavian army stated in an interview in Belgrade's daily Politica that the presence was pursuant to a decree of the Republic and the Supreme Council. The Chamber will recall that, of course, the accused was a member of that council. Visegrad, again, as referred to earlier, in the course of that takeover, Muslims gathered from the town and surrounding settlements, systematically searched, told what was coming their way by White Eagles who were controlling the town. Then the awful incident I referred to yesterday where women and children were burned to death. I needn't go into that. In June of the same year, in the same area, execution of non-Serbs, including women and children who were executed and thrown into the Drina River. Summary executions followed. A witness will be before you at about covering this period of time, who overheard Radmilo Bogdanović, a sometime Serbian Minister of the Interior, arguing with the man Šešelj in a hotel in Bratunac about the takeover in Visegrad. This is what was overheard. We gave you money, we gave you men, we gave you weapons, we gave you freedom to do whatever you want. What else do you want from us? Šešelj replied to that former Serbian minister that in the coming days the work would be done in all the municipalities along the Drina River. Being given freedom to do whatever you want, should that ever turn out to be some form of excuse, it is no excuse at all. It is the clearest revelation of criminal complicity. Prijedor, so well known that to the chamber I expect that I don't need to mention much about it. Can we just look at the picture, please? In the municipality of Prijedor, hundreds of non-Serb civilians systematically killed in various places. A large number of killings continued in various camps, including Amasca and Karatam, throughout 1992. Karadzic had given a forewarning of the brutality that was going to characterize the campaign. In an order issued on the 22nd of September 1991, he said this of his own aspirations and of those whom he led: should these just and aspirations of the Serbian people be opposed, have no mercy, an eye for an eye. Is the accused detached from that approach, if it's an approach that will be established in evidence? It may be thought not thus far by the things that he said in the hearings here. Yes, we have a video of the Prijedor camp. Just have a look at that, please. It's the Tronopoli camp, sorry.
Was the second camp, Tronopoli, where 2,000 refugees are living. We were not prepared for what we saw and heard there.
How long has he been here?
Several hundred said that they'd arrived from Amasca that morning or from another detention camp, released to this refugee center after days, sometimes months of interrogation. We asked if the allegations of beating in the detention centers were true.
I can't say much about that. See, people were hungry. That's true.
I'm not sure that I'm allowed about that. You know, can you understand me?
Tell us the truth.
I'm afraid.
250 ljudi.
250.
Za jednu noć.
Ne, to je dvije.
What happened?
pattern repeated elsewhere, frequently in far worse circumstances, and with many deaths, as we shall hear, resulting. Sanski Most, adjacent to Prijedor and Banja Luka. During the takeover in 1992, 100 non-Serb men brought to Sanski Most from the Karaterm and Amarska camps in Prijedor and killed, detention centers established, and a place to which Arkan returned as late as 1995, when he'd been incorporated into the Red Berets, taking the opportunity to kill many Muslims in different locations. Back to northern Bosnia and the town of Brčko, critical for its position as part of the corridor along the north, adjacent to Bijeljina. It may not be shown on the map, but yes, there it is. Again, not actually originally declared, and of course a municipality that's had special status since. A place where there was an execution of Bosnian Muslim males at the Hotel Pasavina on the 4th of May, and of course where there was a Luka camp presided over by, at one stage, or not presided over, the scene of the killings by a man called Milosevic, who gave himself the name of Serbian Adolf. Interestingly enough, in that area, and on the 20th of May of 1992, the body of a man called Branislav Filipovic was found, apparently a senior member of a paramilitary group. From his body, a number of documents, or not from his body, from the clothes he was wearing, a number of documents were recovered. They included written authorization addressed to the JNA headquarters in Belgrade, authorizing him to collect weapons. Documents stamped the 13th of May of 1992 with a JNA military postcode from Belgrade. Documentation that weapons had been delivered, documenting that weapons had been delivered to the Brčko garrison. Travel records from a JNA vehicle, and also passes from Brčko and also from Semberia, the declared municipality to the east, allowing him freedom of movement. Well, what was he doing there with all those documents in the absence of active involvement by Serbia in what was going on at this area of Brčko? A short reference to what was going on down in the south, in Herzegovina and near the Montenegrin border. Significant loss of life there, in Foča and Đirovo and so on. The notorious KP Dom prison. In Nevesinje, many Muslims killed. Finally, I suppose, a reference to Bosanski Samic and Doboj, two municipalities in the northern Bosnia semi-autonomous district. Names well known here. In the Scheveningen camp in Bosanski Samic, 17 non-Serb detainees killed on the 6th of May, the camp not being closed until 1992. 1,700 people expelled, and a number of prisoners from Bosanski Samic flown by helicopter into Serbia to a JNA military base of Batanja, just outside Belgrade. Well, a report of the VRS in 1993 discussed the results of the takeover. It said this: could hardly be simpler. Corridors were secured to link Serbian territories with Mother Serbia. Ronna, our case is, I hope, clear. Can I detach us from the events on the ground to something slightly different, because it comes at the end of 1992 and can fit before I deal, as I must briefly, with Sarajevo and Srebrenica. It's a document that reflects the view of the Secretary of State, Eagleberger of the United States. And it may provide an interesting view. I'm sorry, it's not within your papers. It's my mistake. I'll get a copy printed and provided. I'll read it from the Elmo to make sure that from the overhead projector to make sure that it's legible. Secretary of State Eagleberger on Wednesday, this is December the 16th, 1992, is the press release, said that Serbian President Slobodan Milošević and the leader of Bosnian Serbs must answer in a court of law, I would hope, for atrocities committed by military and detention camp commanders in shattered Yugoslavia. Went on to deal with the question of the lifting of embargo, and then later said this: "The fact of the matter is, we know that crimes against humanity have occurred. We know when and where they occurred. We know, moreover, which forces committed those crimes and under whose command they operated." And then later, in short, Eagleberger said, Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic, leader of the Bosnian Serbs, have systematically flouted agreements to which they have solemnly yet cynically given their assent. And over the page, Milosevic Karadzic, General Ratko Mladic, commander of Bosnian Serb military forces, must eventually explain whether and how they sought to ensure, as they must under international law, that their forces complied with international law. Well, no doubt the accused will make further reference, as he had, to what was to happen later, at Dayton and so on. Well, this tribunal is only concerned, perhaps tangentially, with the workings of politics. But let there be no doubt. First, this accused was already being identified, well identified, for complicity. But second, and the point of irresistible importance in this case, he was on notice from the highest authority of his duty to comply with international law. And it will be for the Chamber to decide in due course whether he took any notice of that warning and others like it at all. Sarajevo. We've already seen, of course, what Karadzic said in his 6 points about what should happen in Sarajevo. And in response to what was happening in northern Bosnia, the Bosnian president, Alija Izetbegović, issued a mobilization call for the Bosnian territorial defense. Bosnian Serb leadership said they regarded this as an act of war. And we have one picture here of a victim of what was to follow in the awful events of Sarajevo. That declaration of war led to some changes in the joint presidency, particularly so far as Plasic was concerned. The day after that declaration, the 5th of April 1992, Serb paramilitaries laid siege to the police academy in the southern part of the city. Forces moved down from Vraća Hill. And this town, or city, a clear and long-standing example of the integration of ethnic groups and of tolerance, place where Muslims, Serbs, Croats, Yugoslavs and Jews had coexisted. Indeed, their places of worship, cheek by jowl together in the old town, was subject to the following, as it may be described. The siege of Sarajevo, for that's what it was popularly known as, was an episode, it may be decided, of such notoriety in the conflict of the former Yugoslavia that we must go back to World War II to find a parallel in European history. Not since then had a professional army conducted a campaign of unrelenting violence against the civilians of a European city, so to reduce them to a state of medieval deprivation in which they were in constant fear of death. In the time period of this indictment, nowhere safe for a Sarajevan, not at home, at school, in hospital, to be free from indiscriminate attack. The civilians who chose to remain in Sarajevo, about 350,000 of them, deliberately targeted by those forces of the VRS that encircled Sarajevo. Through the actions of snipers, civilians were shot in their homes as they watched television, drank coffee or prayed, shot outside their homes as they crossed the street, cleared rubbish, collected wood for heat or fetched water, as they rode in buses or on trams. In addition, shelling by the VRS, particularly through the use of mortars specifically designed to kill and maim, targeted civilians that queued to collect water at some of the wells, targeted groups of children playing near residences, schools, hospitals, targeted funeral processions, and of course, most notoriously, it may be crowded marketplaces. We accept that our proof against this accused, certainly at this stage, for complicity in these awful events is via his support for the Republic of Srpska and via his support for its army. We do not, of course, exclude the possibility of being able to go further in due course. Srebrenica, the safe area, so declared, until on the 11th of July 1995, troops of the Republic of Srpska's VRS army and MUP troops under the command of Mladic and others executed over 6,500 Bosnian Muslim men and boys from the Srebrenica enclave, picture of a mass grave. And that was carried out over a 5-day period by firing squads in the area south of Zvornik, which we've been looking at, Bratunac. 1,500 men and boys murdered in Bratunac during this period of time in various villages, 5,000 men and boys murdered in Zvornik. The largest single massacre in Europe since World War II. The one distressing photograph we show, the important point perhaps being what can be found round the man's head. In addition to these matters, we intend to lead evidence in support of the indictment of extensive systematic plunder and destruction of private property of those expelled, the intentional destruction of mosques, historical and cultural institutions, churches and other buildings, destruction carefully calculated to ensure that when the conflict ended, those expelled had little, if anything, to which to return. Again, as in the previous indictment, I do not need to relate that which is publicly available in the listing of charges against this accused. As a postscript and a further link back to Croatia, this small detail. A witness before you will testify that as a member of the military intelligence, he was aware in 1995 of the accused's intention to stop supporting the Krajina and to allow it to fall back into the control of Croatia. Well, whether his measure of control is exactly as substantial as that, something the prosecution asserts, is of course the tribunal in due course to establish on all the evidence. But the witness can help us further. He and thousands of other Serb refugees crossed into Serbia. We looked in 1993 at how this accused was prepared to treat his own people when they did things he didn't like. How was he prepared to treat these people? Did he welcome them back? Or did he use them for his own purposes? They were prevented from leaving the highway by police officers who funneled the fleeing Serbs down to Croatia, where they could affect the Serb populations in areas in a minority, all part of an overall plan. I turn to Kosovo. Can we have the Yugoslavian map up, please? Kosovo is rather a small area, really, and it's being marked by Miss Graham on the map for us. Under the ICTY statute, if I said they were funneled to Croatia in relation to the previous witness, I should have said to Kosovo, and I'm grateful for that. Under the ICTY statute covered in this indictment, offences charged include crimes against humanity, deportations, transfers, murders, persecution, and violations of the laws and customs of war, such as murder. I dealt yesterday with the overall statistics for Kosovo. A word about its historical context, and we'll put on another map. Thank you. Shows things. Or shows Kosovo itself, bordered by Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, and so on, rather better. It was one of the two autonomous provinces of the Socialist Republic, as I explained yesterday, had its own constitution, local government, and police under that 1994 constitution, and right up until 1989. It's been contested territory for much of its history. Various claims made about people's ancestors, and so on. It remained Ottoman or Turkish by rule until 1912, when it was taken by Serbian and Montenegrin forces in the Balkan Wars, then to be occupied by the Austro-Hungarians in 1915. Serb troops returned in 1918, and Kosovo became part of the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. In the Second World War, it was again occupied by Bulgaria, Germany, and Italy, and at the end of the Second World War, was formally annexed to Serbia. It's an area that's always been ethnically mixed, containing, of course, Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, but also many other groups, including Turks, Roma, and some Croats, some Bosniaks, and so on. I played yesterday the Kosovo Polje, No One Should Dare to Beat You video clip, and also the 28th of June 1989 speech. Between 1989 and 1992, with its autonomy dismantled by Serbia, and with its provincial institutions being dissolved, it was effectively being taken over by the Republic of Serbia. And Kosovo Albanians found themselves dismissed from their institutions and jobs and businesses, the majority of them state or socially owned. Discriminatory measures were put in place. It may be thought clearly aimed at altering the ethnic balance in Kosovo. The Serbs were able to come and take jobs, even when they're not particularly qualified for them, getting housing and benefits to lure them there. And indeed, there were the Serb refugees sent there, as I eventually, when corrected, reminded you. I think we last picked up the history, and I'm going to deal with the history as briefly as I can, but I must deal with Kosovo in some detail. We picked up the history, I think, with the 7th of September 1990 declaration by the Assembly, the Kosovo Assembly of the Republic of Kosovo. There was then in 91 an unofficial referendum where they voted overwhelmingly for independence from Serbia. And in May 92, they held unofficial elections for an assembly and a president of what they called the Republic of Kosovo, a parallel government whose dominant political attitude was non-violent resistance. You heard yesterday, of course, how not so very many years earlier, and following the death of Tito, there had been the cry of Republika Kosovo. That's something that had actually been heard before, but we are concerned with its occurrence here and in the relevant part of the history that will drive conclusions in this case. In the face of this legal, social, and economic Serbianization of Kosovo, the Serbian Assembly denounced it as Albanianization of Kosovo and denounced that as the greatest ethnic cleansing in Europe. Carried out, it was said, with the goal of cutting Kosovo off from Serbia and Yugoslavia, arguing at that time, in 1992, that there were many illegal immigrants from Albania inhabiting Kosovo. How detached was it to take this view? How detached from reality was it to take this view when ethnic cleansing by Serbs was going on in eastern Bosnia? Well, we pass through those awful conflicts and come, of course, to Dayton in 1995. The effectively non-violent Kosovo Albanians were disappointed in Dayton. Some, and I've said how detached we must be in this tribunal from the world of politics, some may have thought that by Dayton some aspects of ethnic cleansing have been rewarded. That may have affected the view that those Kosovan Albanians would hold as to the future utility of a non-violent approach. As we look at what was to come and the Dayton peace negotiations, of which no doubt the accused will speak, it's worth reminding ourselves, I needn't list them, that although President of Serbia, and not until much later, President of Yugoslavia, it was this accused who the politicians turned to between 1991 and 1995. The reason it may be, as I suggested yesterday, because he did have the power and it was hoped that he was the person who was going to be able to deliver. It may be that he was the person who impressed international negotiators with charm or even seeming reasonableness and moderation, even if appearances were different from what was revealed on the ground. I think he told Your Honours at his initial appearance he should be given credit for peace in Bosnia, not for war. Well, it may be that by the time of Dayton he didn't want war anymore, at least not at that time, because peace meant securing for Bosnian Serbs about half of the country that they devastated. It would mean an end to sanctions that were then in place, and it would of course end the massive drain of the Bosnian war machine. The Chamber may remember my suggestion yesterday that the first two battles were battles he could afford to win, at least afford for a time until he could go no further. The last one was one he could not afford to lose. But of course, whatever decisions the accused made in 1995 have no effect on his involvement in what was done before, if the evidence reveals those to have been crimes. I've already made the point about Secretary of State Eagleberger's view some years earlier. I move on from Dayton because I'm concerned with its effect on the Kosovo Albanians and on the history of what was happening in Kosovo. Save, of course, simply to say this. It would always have been possible after Dayton for this accused to have reflected the position he's already represented as being his to this chamber, and to bring to justice men such as Slivančanin, Mrksić, Mladić, and Arkan, if he was sincere. You judge a man, of course, sometimes for his sincerity, not by what he says, but by what he does. Those men he gave a home and refuge in Serbia, rewarding some of them with promotions and the access to great wealth. Following Dayton, in September 1996, there was an agreement signed by the accused and Ibrahim Rugova, the leader of the Kosovo Albanians, an agreement that should have provided some of the educational rights that had been taken away from the Albanians. Some hopes actually that the agreement would be implemented, but it wasn't. But Rugova pursued the non-violent strategy, even though he may have been having little success and getting little for it. And so it was in the mid-1990s that a faction of Kosovo Albanians organized the group that we know as the KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, or UCK in the language of the Kosovo Albanians. And this group advocated a campaign of armed insurgency and violent resistance to the Serbian authorities, and indeed in mid-96, started launching attacks primarily on Serbian police forces, to which the Serbian police responded forcefully against suspected KLA bases and against suspected supporters of the KLA in Kosovo. In 1996, back in Serbia, or in Serbia generally, the accused may have felt himself under some pressure when local elections did not go his way. This probably followed economic pressures or may have reflected some entente between opposition parties. In any event, it led to the accused having some difficulties between November 96 and January 97 with demonstrations against him and so on. The Serbian MUP was pressed to use force against demonstrators. The man Stanisic, to whom I've already referred, resisted. Perisic also signalled he was against the use of the army. And it may be that it's at this time that we will see the beginnings of a rift between these two men and the accused. If so, was he beginning to feel vulnerable? If so, does that perhaps explain some of his subsequent conduct? Although the Chamber will be concerned to establish particular events and particular states of mind by hard evidence, it will inevitably, from time to time, hear or become acquainted with views about the motivation and driving forces of this accused. And it may be that at some stage it will need to consider as a possibility. This was an accused, a man who, when things were difficult, could find an advantage in, for example, the chaos of war, from which he would be subsequently, he hoped, able to rebuild something and move on. Well, if he was facing difficulties at home of one kind or another, and even the beginnings of dissent from those upon whom he had to rely, was he reaching the stage where, as I suggested yesterday, the forecast that Kosovo's turn would come was becoming an inevitability? In June of 97, in a speech in Kosovo, the accused made it quite plain that there was to be no international mediation for Kosovo, that it was forever an integral part of Serbia. Milosevic was elected as president of what was called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia on the 15th of July 1997, taking up office on the 23rd of July. And we have another wiring diagram. Now this is slightly different from...
Have we got this? We should have it if not.
I hope so, yes.
It's the new bundle you're going on.
It's the new
to,
bundle
right?
that was given yesterday, and I hope it's the middle of that, I think. Thank you very much. Oh, third item, thank you. This is headed differently from the other two, because, of course, everything that happens in Kosovo definitely happens within Serbia. It's headed De Jure Command, Yugoslav Army, Serbian Ministry of Internal Affairs. The top right-hand dotted line box represents the Supreme Defense Council. We've heard of that before. I'm so sorry, people hadn't had these. The accused, along with the presidents Đukanović and Milutinović, respectively of Montenegro and Serbia, constituted the Supreme Defense Council. And the precise functioning of this council will be a matter of evidence, but what it may come to is this, that the president, commanding the army both in war and peace, acted pursuant to decisions made by the council. How that took effect, of course, would depend on the individuals and their true independence or otherwise of the accused. But in any event, he remains, he told us about this himself, Commander-in-Chief. And we can see that therefore he had command of the General Staff, Colonel General Ojanic, the Third Army, Colonel General Pavković, and then down through them we come to the Pristina Corps and the Pristina Military District. Underneath the Supreme Defense Council, but not connected to it on this diagram, is the President of Serbia, Milutinović, with a connection, and again, a matter for evidence how direct, to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Stojilković, and the MUP. From there, a number of divisions, some of them simply fighting units. And if we come down on the left-hand side through the State Security Division under Marković, the Special Operations Unit, JSO, under Simatović, was a fighting unit. If we come down on the right-hand side under the Public Security Division of the RDB, Đorđević, the Secretariats of Internal Affairs, the Special Police Units, and the Special Anti-Terrorist Units, SUP, PJP, and SAJ, all fighting units. The prosecution's case is that whatever the technical division under law may have been, in fact, the accused had influence on all these bodies, and it may well be effective control. But in any event, under the law on defense, as commander of the army, he had the advantage of control over all units in time of imminent threat of war or a state of war, because there was then subordination of the MUP to the VJ.
Mr. Nice. But you can see that your diagram shows his authority as being confined to specific units.
I'm not conceding that his practical authority was confined in any way. This is what the de jure position was in time of peace. In time of war, the subordination of the MUP to the VJ in any event, so that he would have complete control at that time, and the evidence may well reveal that he had effective control at all times of all units in any event. But this is a diagram to take us forward in looking at the legal position when we have it before us.
So we'll await the evidence. Huh?
Yes, certainly. This is the legal position, and it's in very short form. I hope really a useful way for the Chamber to start its approach to matters of fact and law that it will have to analyse, or may have to analyse. So in his position as President, thus, in part, his powers. In 1987, August, student demonstrations at Pristina. In September 87, 97, I'm so sorry, Your Honour, yes, of course, 97. September, the position didn't improve, and there was further armed activity by Kosovo Albanians. In October 97, the police breaking up non-violent student demonstrations in Pristina. In October of 97, we have the following apparently sincere dialogue being opened up by the DB with representatives of Kosovo Albanians. But further student demonstrations, and in November, as we will hear from the very first witness in this case, an approach made to leaders of the Kosovo Albanians by those on behalf of the Serbian government, where the possibility of Kosovo attaining republic status within the federal Yugoslavia was raised. The Belgrade side of this discussion, if we can so characterize it, rejected that possibility out of hand, saying that if the Albanians insisted on such a demand, it meant war. It was also explained at that meeting, as we will hear from the witness, that there was a plan, a scorched earth plan, that could be implemented within 24 hours to destroy Albanian villages. And the witness was told that the accused and the man Jovica Stanisic knew about the meeting that was being conducted at that time, that it was a meeting with authority. A second such meeting occurred in December of 1997. On this occasion, the witness from whom we will hear and Stanisic spoke privately. Stanisic saying that there was a nationalist circle around this accused that would go to war before accepting as a possibility a Kosovo republic. January 1998. The Chamber will, of course, remember that the indictment for Kosovo doesn't start until 1999, but nevertheless, a little of the background of 1998 must be sketched in. In February, the conflict intensified between the KLA and the forces of the Republic of Serbia. A number of Kosovo Albanians and Kosovo Serbs were killed and wounded during this time, with forces of the Republic engaged sometimes in shelling Albanian towns and villages, destroying property and expelling populations from areas in which the KLA was or was thought to be active. And indeed, the United Nations estimate was that by mid-October of 1998, over 298,000 persons, about 15% of the population, had been internally displaced within Kosovo or had been forced out of the province by what was happening. As early as March of 1998, the Security Council, in its Resolution 1160, condemned the use of excessive force by Serbian police forces against civilians and peaceful demonstrators in Kosovo and imposed an arms embargo on the Republic. 6 months later, a further resolution, 1199, was passed, which said that the deterioration of the situation in Kosovo constituted a threat to peace and security in the region. and demanded that all parties cease hostility and that the security forces used for civilian repression be withdrawn. It's pretty clear that as a result of what was happening, the armed insurgency was enjoying wider sympathy than had formerly been the case. And demonstrations supportive of an independent Kosovo, frequently large demonstrations, took place. A mention of a man we've heard before, Vojislav Šešelj. In March of this year, 1998, he became the Deputy Prime Minister of Yugoslavia. He, the Chamber will remember, President of the Serbian Radical Party, founder of the Serbian Chetnik movement, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia from this date until 2000. Throughout the period of the war in Kosovo. An outspoken advocate, I remind the Chamber, of the Greater Serbia Plan, and an express approver of the notion of ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. Within Kosovo in 1998, there was one particular attack on the family of Armeti in a compound in Likasan or Likasani, 16 people killed, 10 more killed on the following day. I use the word compound. There's one feature of Kosovo Albanian life that distinguishes them from others. They live in, for the most part I think, multi-generational homes. Many families, well, families, extended families in the same location, and their properties are surrounded by substantial walls that make quite genuinely and simply compounds. So when we use the word compound, it's that we'll be describing. I don't think we have a picture of a typical Kosovo Albanian residence, but we'll probably find one in the course of the trial. It's a singular feature of the place. In or between February 1998 and March of 1998, Perisic and Stanisic suggested to this accused that he should conclude a deal with the leader, Rugova, but at the same time, special MUP and anti-terrorist units were being sent into Kosovo to deal with the KLA. It was at about this time that the accused was heard to say or said that the actual number of Kosovo Albanians was around 800,000. Does the Chamber remember yesterday how I explained that because of a boycott of the 1991 census, estimates only are available of the true population of Kosovo by groups at the material time. Because of that, you'll have evidence of demographers and so on to help you. But it may be that there will be little doubt in due course, but that the figures are radically different from what was being suggested by the accused at this low figure of 800,000. Why did he say things like that? Why did he seek to persuade, if that's what he was doing, that the population was as small, so far as the Albanians were concerned, as he said? Was it because that's what he was hoping would come about? Or was it in order to make less terrible the presumption he was to take of trying to move the enormous population that in due course he did try to move? the point that he made to the witness I've referred to already was something he made to others. And the court may wonder whether there was emerging in his mind an exit strategy, as it were, for Kosovo, along the lines of the exit strategy that had worked, in a sense, for Bosnia. By the Dayton Agreement, the Serb part of Bosnia, as it had been, was still almost wholly monoethnic in favor of the Serbs. He may have thought, this accused, that blame had been forgotten. He may have thought that whereas the decade of enticing Serbs to Kosovo, luring them there, had not achieved the objective he had in mind, that he could do again what he'd done before and not be blamed for it. And I don't know if that's a convenient moment or if that's too early.
You'll finish before the next adjournment, I take
I
it.
certainly hope so. But,
And then we'd hear from Mr. Reinfeldt.
Mr. Reinfeldt will help us with a little bit about the crime scenes. It saved me that burden.
You. Yes, we'll adjourn now until 11:30.
All rise for your vote. Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. Lyth.
From 1998, ahead of the indictment period, of course, you will hear of a heavy attack on a compound of the Yashari family, where 54 people were killed. It's probably quite clear that there were KLA members or a member or even criminals involved in that compound. The excessive use of force, however, the death of women and children couldn't be justified or excused. We have a picture of the building. It doesn't actually show the compound nature of the building very well, and then after that we have a picture of those people who were killed there, some of them, after they'd been laid out. Next, we have, or we will have a letter, or reference to a letter sent by Perisic to the accused from a witness who was protected but whose name has now been revealed to the accused, so he knows where it comes from, explaining that his strategy in Kosovo was to produce casualties, destroy villages, and would lead to rebellion. It would be for the chamber to decide whether the account of this letter is accurate. In April of 1998, the MUP and the VJ were bombarding buildings in the location of Dečani. The suggestion is they were ordered from the top, despite the recommendation of the local commander for a surgical intervention to behave in the way they did. The first witness to be called before us in a day or so's time met the accused again in April of 1998. The accused spoke of terrorists he was willing to annihilate. was some negotiation about the position of the Albanian Kosovans, or Kosovo Albanians. The witness told the accused that what was happening in this fight against terrorism involved attacks on innocent civilians, women and children. So he was on notice. If he had no earlier notice, we say, of course he did, of what was being involved. In May of 1998, a group of 5 Kosovo Albanians met with the accused and his chef de cabinet. They discussed that attack on the Yashari compound, saying it was a case of police brutality. Interestingly enough, the accused, and this may make further relevance to this incident, seemed very well informed as to that particular incident. He said it was under investigation, said he had many problems. I have many nationalists around me, he said, but we'll solve those problems, and claimed to have full control of Kosovo. We have evidence that there was the arming of the Serbian population of Kosovo in preparation for what was to come. And there's a document, I don't think we're going to produce it at the moment, unless I'm mistaken, going to show quite clearly that weapons were to be distributed to Serbians and the Montenegrin population. In the spring or summer of 1998, there were heavy-handed offensives against the KLA, with the shelling of villages, paramilitary shock troops being used. And there was, in June of 1998, the beginning of some attacks on the village of Račak, which features, of course, in the history of Kosovo. It may be that there were KLA present there and that explained why Račak in particular was targeted. In June of 1998, we have some exhibits. We have a document, an order of the 125th Motorized Brigade, a ban on operations without the knowledge and approval of a joint command. We can see that. The joint command thus identified, and the document is dated the 7th of July, comes into existence. Pursuant to the order of the Joint Command, strictly confidential number so-and-so, is the aim of increasing effectiveness in performing assignments, so on. Incidentally, I'm sorry that it's always impossible to go into all these documents at length in an opening. To do that, the opening would become far too long, but both as to documents and as to things like speeches. What will matter in due course is the context in which particular passages are placed by the Chamber when it has the document or the exhibit as a whole. But back to the Joint Command or the Joint Headquarters, including, as we will discover, apart from the accused, Milutinovic and others, including Pavkovic, Lukic, Shinovic, Stanisic, and others. Was this creation of the Joint Command a turning point, and was it something that was going to lead to the events of 1999? Was it a means, the Joint Command, involving all these people, of circumventing any resistance to the will of this accused, or to smooth the way to what was to be unlawful use of the army? Witnesses will speak of that before you. One witness told the accused that the MUP was engaged in operations, this is in the summer of 1998, against the civilian population. The accused denied, said the only target was the KLA. But, and indeed he would continue to insist on that as his explanation. Several witnesses will deal with that in due course. And I needn't go into that in any more detail. On the 28th of July of 1998, Peter Ilic, head of the Pristina Defense Administration, issued to all Kosovo municipalities the Joint Command for Kosovo, regulations for the defense of inhabited areas, including the separation of populations and the use of force by the army, including artillery, support for the MUP, and so on. So plans were in hand at that stage, including separation of the population, including use of the army to deal with points to come under the Joint Command for Kosovo. And I move on trying to save time. On the 24th of June of 1998, still of course before the indictment period, a Captain Slobodan Milošević from the PECH MUP Secretariat reported that during an operation called Thunder, conducted in May and June, platoons of the 3rd Company of the 24th Detachment of a special police unit called the PJP had been subordinated to a body called the JSO, which was the body of Frankie's boys, Frankie being a person we've heard of before, further recurring connections. The same Captain Perovic also reports flatly that during the operation no one demolished, torched or looted facilities. Why, one might ask, was it necessary to put such a thing in a report? In July of 1998, heavy army and MUP assault on Dulje, a place near Unic or in Unic. 30,000 Albanians fled. At the same time, at widely spaced out places in the province of Kosovo, similar things were happening, suggestive, it may be, even at that stage of coordinated action. Meanwhile, the arming of Serb civilians continued. We'll hear a great deal of detail about that. And there was distribution of weapons in Mitrovica, some 7,400 weapons distributed to reserve police members in Kozovska Mitrovica sub-area, which was several municipalities. I'm going too fast. Thank you. I apologize. In August of 1998, the Kosovo Diplomatic Observer Mission and other diplomats found themselves involved. The army and the MUP often denied freedom of movement to these international monitors and observers, saying that they were denying them movement for their own safety. Therefore, those observers were only ever able to verify shellings or excesses after the event and or from a distance. Nevertheless, the Chamber may be left in no doubt from them that there were joint army and MUP operations and the use of heavy artillery and tanks against villages at this early stage, or comparatively early stage. Paramilitary's presence was also confirmed, for example, in Dubrava prison and in a place called Istok. Dubrava prison, a very large prison in the northwest or thereabouts, northwest centre of the province, is going to feature in the crime base evidence that you'll hear in due course. There was looting and burning going on, again attributed to the MUP and to their special forces, the PJP, in the summer. The accused, when told of these things, denied that there were any such activities, denied that there was fleeing of the police, and when told that there were Albanians crossing the border, he said that they were just fabricating a story for some reason. By the summer of 1998, 200,000 Kosovo Albanians had been expelled. They were astray within Kosovo. They found refugee status, as it were, in the towns and villages that were still under government control, huge numbers staying in the open without shelter, for example, in areas held by the KLA, and so on. You'll hear about these displacements and dispersion of individuals. Where there was looting, and there was looting from time to time, in excesses against Kosovo Albanians, no intervention by the, or no satisfactory intervention by the MUP on their behalf. In September of 1998, in Golubovac, some 14 Kosovo Albanians lined up and shot. It may be the Chamber will be satisfied by MOP Special Forces. In September of 1998, on the 28th of September, the Serbian Prime Minister Mirko Marjanović publicly stated that government forces had regained unchallenged control of most of Kosovo and that the rebellion of the KLA had largely failed. Peace had returned to Kosovo, he said. However, of course, contemporaneous documents and other evidence reveals to the contrary. And it reveals that the army, the territorial army, was mobilizing, that the MUP was calling up reserves, that there was a vigorous effort that was creating tensions with the army reserve mechanisms, as both bodies were calling up the same people. Serbs were being armed, training was being provided, and peace had not returned to Kosovo. On the 29th of September of 1998, Paddy Ashdown told this accused that his troops were violating the Geneva Conventions, and his exchange will be of value to you, that witness having particular experience of his own of relevance. This led to the negotiations between US Ambassador Holbrooke and the accused, involving NATO Generals Naumann and Clark. It's well known, of course, that General Clark has detailed these events in his book, and we'll be hearing from General Naumann, I trust. But statements about Albanians by Milosevic, it may be, could be characterized as dehumanization of another group, straight incitement to ethnic cleansing. And General Naumann will further testify as to the conduct of these negotiations, including that the accused control appeared to be not only of the VJ, of the army, but of the MUP as well, for whom he appeared to speak. He'll also speak of the role of that Deputy Prime Minister Scheveningen over both the army and the MUP. In October of 1998, Stanisic was replaced by Markovic as head of the state security of the Serbian MUP, one of several replacements of key positions of the army and the MUP that the Chamber may be satisfied were driven by the accused's need to remove voices of dissent to his policies in Kosovo. A more forceful role for the army with the MUP in Kosovo may have been required than that which the previous office holders would have approved of. In the area of international politics, the accused was going through the motions of political settlement. Domestically, he was gathering around him persons who, as one witness will explain, were prepared for a brutal resolution of the Kosovo question. Still, the documents tell the same story: ethnic division, ethnic mobilization of one part of society, disarming another. We will hear further how the accused spoke at one stage of knowing how to deal with the Albanians that in a way that they'd been dealt with in 1946, Albanians who he described as murderers and bandits, saying that they could be killed, although it would take, how they had been handled in 1946. It had taken several years to kill them, but we killed them all, some such quotation. Not quite clear what it refers to, but in 1946 there was a counterinsurgency in Kosovo, it appears, where there was much destruction of Kosovo-Albanian communities and villages. A component of the agreement between Holbrooke and Milosevic was the agreement on the OSCE Kosovo verification mission, signed on the 16th of October by Chairman of the OSCE, Geremek, and the Foreign Affairs Minister, Jovanovic, for the Republic. This agreement, together with an agreement between General Clark and General Naumann, signed by Scheveningen, and the MUP General Đorđević, together with a further agreement between KDOM and MUP, provided for the partial withdrawal of forces of the FRY and Serbia from Kosovo, and also provided that there should be a limitation on the introduction of additional forces and equipment into the area with deployment of unarmed OSCE verifiers. At that stage, what was the presence of police in Kosovo? Very considerable. And I will have a look at a picture of police in due course quite shortly. In October 1998, 14,500 uniformed police in Kosovo, plus an additional 2,000 on leave. Some 4,500 of these police were from outside Kosovo already. The numbers included special anti-terrorist units. Ambassador, the KVM mission included meetings where Milosevic was told that, where Milosevic explained that Albanians were indeed less than 50% of the population. I've dealt with the potential significance of this type of observation before. In October 1998, Perisic stated privately that the situation in Kosovo was the result of one man's action. At a meeting in October 1998, that same General Perisic, normally of a hard tone, was softened when he was able to have a private conversation and able to explain that it was obvious that NATO, if they wanted to, could destroy the army, which he wanted to save, saying it was the only democratic institution left in Yugoslavia. He was not prepared for the army to be used for the type of operation that may have been in mind for it. He made it clear that it was the accused who had the authority to decide on agreement and no one else. Tanks and artillery continued, however, to be used, or I beg your pardon. At further meetings, it was made quite clear to the Serbian leadership that tanks and artillery in use against civilians and villages was not acceptable, and that if that wasn't accepted so far as the Serbians concerned, then NATO would act. The accused rejected all allegations made, claiming that Serb forces were acting in accordance with the law. On one view, it may be, and I've referred already to theories that the Chamber may have to countenance and weigh, the accused was getting exactly what he wanted, a war from which he could pick up the pieces and move on. If this was his recurring strategy, then, and this was a meeting that we'll hear was characterized by his nerves, by nervousness rather than by his nerves. If he was nervous, then perhaps it was because he knew he was about to take a risk with the lives of other people, which he may not have regarded as highly as the risk he was taking in respect of his own career. But in any event, he rejected the suggestions made, rejected the reality of NATO intervention. That joint command we referred to earlier features again in a report on the 16th of October, where it was said that there was a danger of extremist Albanians importing cameras through the offices of the OSCE in order, it said, to provide documentary evidence of alleged crimes and the excess use of violence and repression by state organs against Albanian civilians. Those writing that report were more concerned with the reporting of excesses than the fact that excesses had occurred. We then come to a meeting on the 24th and 25th of October involving Naumann, the accused, and others, where he was told that the hammer was cocked and that he was told of the shelling of villages by artillery. The accused asked Perisic, who was still there, who denied it, although that same Perisic privately appealed to others to try and settle with the accused. The accused appeared to agree in principle, saying that he had to negotiate further with others, but he then changed any indication of agreement and never signed the agreement that it was open to him at that stage to sign. So that by October, the accused had control of the army, the Federal Ministry of Defense, He had de facto control of the MUP. He designated Scheveningen, the federal deputy prime minister and a long-term ally, as his representative in Kosovo. And he strengthened that position by coordinating the MUP, or having coordinated the MUP, the VJ, local defence, civil defence, and other institutions on the ground by order of the Joint Command headed by Scheveningen. Serbs and Montenegrins were being armed. Operations of the MUP and the VJ were continuing. A senior official at this very time was still able to see one of the villages, a village called Makramal, on fire immediately after an attack by the MUP. The question in relation to such events always arises: if this was just an attack on the KLA, why destroy a whole village? The process of disarming the Kosovo Albanians continued. We have evidence of how they were forced to surrender their weapons. In November, General Dimitrijevic told a witness called Crossland, a military attaché, that Perisic was visiting the army in Kosovo, telling them not to react to provocations, but that a man called Pavkovic might act outside of the army command. And if he did so, it would be on the orders of this accused, via Scheveningen. He admitted, indeed, that the army had overstepped the mark that summer. 383. In November, it was that the accused finally made the critical replacements of key senior staff. Chief of Staff Perisic was replaced by General Odanic. Closely linked was the replacement of General Samardzic by General Pavkovic as commander of the Third Army, and the subsequent elevation of General Lazarevic to fill the post of commander of the Pristina Corps left vacant by Pavkovic's promotion. And what we're looking at is a picture of General Odanic. Compliant commanders in Odanic and Pavkovic would be needed if this accused was fully to engage the army and the MUP in the attacks in Kosovo. Odanic had been seen, interestingly, at rallies of that party that was associated with the accused's wife. Pavkovic was present at SPS functions, the party of this accused, both before and after the war of 1999. In November, the KVM deployed monitors in implementation of the agreement between Holbrooke and the accused, but violence continued. As to the man Scheveningen, he took an active role in negotiations involving the OSCE. He participated in numerous other meetings. He acted as the accused liaison to Kosovo Albanians. He exercised control over numerous individuals. He is a man of importance in the story that will unfold. A snapshot. Late 1998 or early 1999, when told that a MUP officer had been seen driving away with a trailer full of looted goods, and that other MUP officers were burning a village with gasoline, the accused became agitated. He said this was unacceptable. He took responsibility. He ordered somebody to have the unit that was said to have committed these offences moved. An interesting reaction, but it may not be an uncommon one. Much worse things were to come in Kosovo. Did he take responsibility then? More significant, why just move the unit? Why not, consistent with his duties, investigate, punish, and prevent recurrence? January 1999, scores of OSCE verifiers throughout Kosovo observed the continuation of hostilities. During this period, verifiers documented a number of killings of Kosovo Albanians, the most famous or notorious being Račak. Small, very small community, quite remote from the village or town to which it is connected. I think one road in or one small road in, possibly one small road out, further road out. What happened there in Račak, in the municipality of Scheveningen, was that it was shelled and the fleeing villagers were shot. 25 men found in a building were moved to a nearby hill and shot. 40 in total were killed. I said already it was clear that the KLA had been present in Račak. It was also clear that there had been a killing of a policeman, perhaps arguably by the KLA, for which this may have been a revenge attack. The attack doesn't feature in the allegations reflected in the indictment. Nevertheless, it will be investigated, perhaps in the evidence, for it had an important effect on what was to follow, and it may be the Chamber will be quite satisfied that this was wholly unjustified attack of the worst kind. Yes, this is an acknowledgement in a document of the 15th of January 1999 from the Ministry of the Interior of the Republic of Serbia. It says this: overview of occurrences and developments and activities. Starting at 0300 hours on the 15th of January, measures were taken to seal off the village of Račak with a view to capturing and destroying a terrorist group, which, according to our information, had committed several terrorist attacks with lethal consequences in the territory of Milosevic SUP. At 0630, the village was completely encircled. You cut out the light. Fold it now. Thanks. About, and then a numbers not illegible, members of the Albanian terrorist were liquidated, and it goes on materially. No civilians were hurt during the execution of the operation. Inaccurate and untrue, intentionally so, a matter for the Chamber to decide. Here are some of the pictures that reflect what was in due course found. A member of the MUP Secretariat told a witness that he had indeed been responsible for the attack on Račak, as that document, in a sense, we've looked at, would confirm. Shortly after Račak, the accused told a senior policy witness that investigations would show that our people didn't do this. He seemed to have a knowledge of the outcome before any investigation had been done. He said to the same witness, "Kosovo is more important than my head." General Naumann will explain how, on the 18th of January of 1999, the accused was confident he could solve the Kosovo problem by military means and in a short period of time. Milosevic had been told by now by countless people and through many channels that the means he was using in Kosovo were criminal, were resulting in widespread suffering amongst the civilian population. His own staff were telling him he was generating recruits for the KLA and weakening the moderate voices among Kosovo Albanians. He spoke of using military means. Did he have any other approach in mind, or was he simply anticipating the final resolution that was to come? There was a third meeting between Naumann and others and this accused on the 19th of January concerning Račak in particular. He was given a list of incidents in which disproportionate force had been used. He said he'd look into it. On the 29th of January, 12 people were killed in the area of Rogovo Jakovica, and we move on to February. Scheveningen, along with the President of Serbia, Milosevic, were involved in the negotiations at Rambouillet. Putting it very shortly, evidence may satisfy the Chamber that while the world was holding its breath, there was a lack of sincerity in these negotiations, and that in any event, those in Rambouillet didn't have the authority without reference back to negotiate. Some witnesses believe that some of those present on the Serb side were trying conscientiously, and that will all have to be taken into account, as will the fact that Albanians were perhaps hesitant to sign. The Chamber will, if it decides that this is an important matter to investigate, will have to see things from all sides. But the prosecution's invitation will be that there was a lack of sincerity. While the peace negotiations were going on, the violence continued, and Serbia launched a series of offensives against several Kosovo Albanian villages and towns. Coming forward, and on the 10th of March, the accused stated he knew that if he hadn't signed in October, he could have cleared up the problem in a week, meaning, no doubt, the KLA problem. He rejected comparisons he was invited to make at that stage with Vietnam or Afghanistan, saying of himself he knew how things should be done, he knew how to do it. On the 20th of March, the party majority on the Serb Assembly rejected what was described as the Paris Accord. The situation in Kosovo was unchanged, and that throughout the Rambouillet and Paris processes, forces of the FRY and of Serbia were massing on the borders. No one will contest that Yugoslavia had a legitimate interest to defend itself against an impending NATO air campaign. No one would contest that, of course, it had a legitimate interest in preparing for combat against any armed insurgency on its territory. But the accused had been told all that he had been told, and had said in reply that he had the intention to provide a definitive resolution. And this was a resolution to use his military. He couldn't help, perhaps, revealing his obsession with the demographic balance. The Serbian population in Kosovo had been mobilized, as it were, on his behalf, and the majority Albanians disarmed. May it be that the NATO campaign he brought upon himself provided him with the opportunity to accomplish those goals while purporting to defend his country. One participant at Rambouillet, a member of the Serbian delegation, was heard to say that if NATO falls, there will be a massacre in Kosovo. Will be. They weren't, of course, the accused's words, nor were they true in a sense, for the massacre effectively came before. Even if there was no devious plan of the kind I summarize, as many think, to lure external violence onto Kosovo to justify pushing the Albanians out, the doing of it when it happened is without excuse or justification of any kind and would remain offences as described in this indictment. Agreement was impossible, and in consequence, and as a result, the orange vehicles of the KVM monitors pulled out of Kosovo. The NATO bombs, as we know, began to fall. As they did so, and even before, the forces of FRY and Serbia began their systematic attacks against the Albanian population, of which we will hear in sufficient detail to equip the chamber by Mr. Reinveld in due course. At that stage, there was other evidence of the accused being uninterested, apparently, in further discussion. And on the very eve of the war, he made further personnel changes, replacing the head of the army counterintelligence, Dimitrievich, by General Farkas. And so it was that on the 23rd of March, he declared an imminent threat of war, which had, in law, as we've already seen, the effect of subordinating the VJ, the MUP to the VJ, and on the 24th of March, the Prime Minister, who'd made the earlier declaration, not the President, declared a state of war. Prosecution's submission is that by this time the decision had been made, pursuant to whatever earlier intentions or plan, that the KLA would be annihilated and that, as promised, there would be substantial depopulation of large parts of Kosovo, of its Albanian population. On the eve of the heightened conflict, of what were the forces available to the accused comprised elements of the VJ's Third Army, the 52nd Corps, known as the Pristina Corps, several brigades, and also, what's this one? Yes, these are VJ soldiers, thank you very much, we're looking at. In addition, there were the police forces taking part. I said earlier, we just show you what the police forces look like. They are, this is just one picture of many. They are, of course, armed units that to the uninitiated would look probably like an army. We'll see more pictures of them in the course of the trial. They're equipped with APCs, mortars, heavy machine guns, having special units with yet more powerful weaponry. The totality of units, I think, includes military terrorist units, civil defense units, reserve MUP units, as well as the armed Serb civilians, all organized at the municipality level where necessary, falling within official chains of command. Can we look, please, at exhibits 19 and 20? Yes. Your Honour, there is one very simple point that I desire to make in relation to the matters that are going to be dealt with by Mr. Reinveld, and it can be dealt with by this map. I've got a larger version of it. I don't know if it shows up on the screen or if you've got a copy of it to hand. We have a larger version, but I'll have to try and...
We have a copy of it.
Concerned, really. I don't know whether, if we look at the... see if the camera can focus on this and if it's any better than the small version on the Elmo. I don't know if that can be done. See if it's preferable. It may be. Perhaps I can try it and we'll see, and if it doesn't work, the AV unit tell me. Thanks very much. I'll go back to the small version, which is a little bit too condensed. A couple of things. The indictment in this case breaks the events that were to follow down into deportation matters and killing matters. That's really a breakdown that's for the purposes of the indictment rather than necessarily reflecting any distinction of activities on the ground. So when we see references to deportation sites and reference to killing sites, it's not to say that these are entirely separable events. They're obviously integrated, but that's the way it's been done. As the court will know, the prosecution's case is that, so far as Kosovo is concerned, the principal objective was deportation, removal of the population, to be achieved by whatever means were necessary, and killing was, of course, one of them. Kill people, you frighten the others into going. The map that you have before you deals with the sites where deportation is the principal apparent objective of those committing offences, and the sites that appear as deportation sites, thus, in the indictment. As I say, there's always an overlap, and in nearly all deportation sites there were killings. However, we see here the sites with the dates on them of when the deportation activity started. Starting at the top, 25th of March, 29th of March, going round to Pristina, 24th of March, going down a little further, 24th of March, coming across, 25th of March, 27th of March, going down, 24th, 25th of March, and then further down, 25th of March again. Can there be any doubt from that simple coincidence of dates, but that what was happening was an overall and planned deportation and nothing else? That's assuming the Chamber finds the evidence supports deportation starting at those sites on those days. This map also shows, with the little red marks at the borders, the places through which people were deported. The killing sites map, which is the other document you have, and I'll put that up as well, shows a similar story. 26th of March at the top, with other 24th of March at the bottom, 26th of March here, 25th of March at Prizren, 25th of March further up at Jakovica, 26th of March just above that. And as I say, there is in any event a greater integration of killing sites and deportation sites than the indictment itself might suggest. The indictment, of course, also being constrained by the inability to put everything in and having to be selective.
So as far as the sites are concerned, presumably we can look at both types of site under the same heading.
Yes, indeed.
We need to be looking at the sites rather than the particular categories which they
Certainly, yes. And indeed, absolutely so, Your Honour, and indeed in most deportation sites there will be killings as well, the significance of which it may be all too obvious that the killing was itself a part of the pre-plan. The question arises, is it just a natural incident of forces sent to deport people that they will kill, or is it something that they do because it's required of them? And then one other part, and one other point only, because the case can in a sense be dealt with in the most elementary way, quite properly, in looking for the underlying intent of what was being done. The significance of the fact that everybody had their identification papers taken away at the border. Is that accidental or intentional? If it was being done intentionally, was it a plan? What had that plan got to do with NATO, as the accused would ask you to believe? So, with those merely prefatory remarks, I'll turn from the crime base, which I may make one or two observations in the course of what's left of my address, but I'll leave the rest of that to Mr. Reinberg. But the case is extremely simple. Of course, the accused got away with so much in the past, it may be, that he thought he could get away with this. We say, looking at it, as it were, from the top still, when you see all the connections that can be established, both in law and in fact, what was being done was a coordinated effort by leaders of the Republic and of Serbia with their forces acting in concert These were actions similar in nature to what had happened in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where Serbian military and paramilitary forces had forcibly expelled and deported non-Serbs from areas under Serbian control. The evidence and an expert analysis of it in due course will show that the army and the MUP operations correlate strongly with, as between deportations and killings. I've dealt with that already, and why it isn't just a coincidence, it's part of a plan. The operations by the Republic and by Serbian armed forces happened in the areas of responsibility of different army brigades, different MUP stations, different zones of local administration in a coordinated way. And such an operation involving several different organizations under the threat of NATO bombing required a high level of planning. Because in the midst of actions against the KLA and against NATO, the narrow roads of Kosovo landed up being clogged with the refugees that the accused wanted to exclude from their homeland. We say that this is not a case of renegade local groups or anything like that. The scale of the operations and the consistency exclude that as a possibility. And you'll hear evidence directly of coordination of the army and the paramilitaries and other units, all of which answered to this accused. Again, I don't want to trespass on the area that's going to be covered by Mr. Reinveld, but you will hear evidence, in short, that reveals an atmosphere of impunity for crimes being created, however brutal they may have been. As to the suggestion that Albanians moved out of areas of likely combat for their own good, we say the lie will be shown to that when you hear of the detail of what in fact happened and of how it was that these people were driven out. And of course, being moved out for your own good is hardly consistent with having all the documents of identification, your identification papers or your car's documents taken away from you so that you have no identity once you've left. On the 24th of March, there was a discussion with Milosevic, who said there was no problem with Kosovo. We'll hear a little more from Mr. Reinveld about the significance of that conversation in due course. The ruthlessness of the accused's project emerges too from his callous attitude towards Serb victims during the NATO campaign. He said to one person that they needed enough civilian victims to turn the opinion of NATO countries against the bombing. So, in our suggestion to the Chamber, this is a simple, in a sense, case to prove. And the Chamber should not, in due course, although it will explore all matters of importance with great care, we know, it shouldn't allow itself to be misled by the fog that may be created arising from the international negotiations, their twists and turns in which the accused took part, showed resistance, or handed matters over to others. That fog shouldn't be allowed to hide the reality that what happened on this occasion was the intentional, planned, criminal expulsion of his own people because of the attitude they took to him. Ron, just give me 1 minute. matters ended this way. By June 1999, about 800,000 Kosovo Albanians, one-third of the entire Kosovo Albanian population, had been expelled. Thousands more were believed to be internally displaced, and an unknown number had been killed. On the 3rd of June, the FRY and the Federal Republic and Serbia accepted a document of principles towards resolution of the crisis, which was presented to their representatives by Marti Ahtisaari on behalf of the European Community and Victor Chernomyrdin, for the President of the Russian Federation. That was followed by a Security Council resolution providing for a political solution to the Kosovo crisis, including an immediate end to violence and a rapid withdrawal of the Republic's and Serbians' military, police and paramilitary forces. There followed a military technical agreement. And what, by way of postscript to these particular events, well, just this. Mladenic, Pavkovic, Lazarevic, decorated, promoted by this accused. I have a few other supplementary points to make. I just want to check one thing with Mr. Reinveld. Your Honour, it's been of necessity a rapid and abridged account of the accused's involvement over many years in 3 areas of conflict. Abridged, though it has had to be, I hope we have revealed how there are going to be before you many lines of connection. Some connections in law under constitutions and proper authority, many otherwise, that link him unavoidably to the events with which he is charged. There will be many strands of evidence, starting in Kosovo, ending in Kosovo, passing through the failures of, so far as he's concerned, of Croatia and Bosnia, all of which reveal a single, continuing state of mind of his, transaction of his, executed though it might have been, indeed was, through a small but changing and changeable cast of characters. And at the end of the day, what can be said to summarize the awful tragedies into which we must now shortly start to inquire? Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo shared in common that Serbia was either their neighbor, or indeed more than their neighbor so far as Kosovo was concerned, and that the accused had a hand, a controlling hand, in their recent destinies. From the beginning, this accused has attempted to persuade those who would listen to him that what happened was inevitable. His powers of persuasion are considerable. I think I referred yesterday to the power and quality of that speech of his, where he made a reference to the use of armed conflict in a speech that was otherwise apparently full of some good things. He was a man capable of persuading. He was a man capable of having others follow him. But as we look at what happened in former Yugoslavia, things that happened weren't inevitable. They were not the acts of God, but they were the acts of men. They were the results of decisions of men, and significantly of this one, taken with no regard to the interests or even to the lives of others, in a way that this chamber may in due course find hard or impossible to comprehend. And in truth, it was having this accused, so far as Croatia and Bosnia was concerned, as a neighbor, and indeed so far as Kosovo was concerned, having him as a neighbor, that sealed so many fates. In a career spanning 13 years, and we will say a criminal career spanning at least 8 years, it may be hard to express briefly those elements which were constant. But throughout that period, as the learned prosecutor said in her opening remarks, in perhaps slightly different words, he sought two things: to maximize his power and control, including territorial control by and of Serbs, to maximize control over Serbs. He did this by denying basic fundamental rights to those who disagreed with him. And of course, in the brevity of my address, I've understated the wider elements of persecution that the Chamber will be familiar with from other cases and with which we will have to deal here. But he denied all sorts of rights, some that initially looked minor, progressing as they did ultimately to a denial of the right of non-Serbs to live among their neighbors, or indeed to live at all. While he led his country, he always sought to assure them that they were not at war. Serbia was not at war. That the wars he caused were happening elsewhere, in other countries, not our own affair. Does the Chamber recall what I suggested was one of his mechanisms of control, having things done by others over whom he had influence, so that he could absolve himself of moral responsibility and thus explain why, for him, never regret, never shame. Well, he did the same thing with his people. Nothing to do with us. But of course, the distinction upon which he relied for this part of his presentation in the world, the distinction of state from state, mattered not at all to him. As indeed, as was said at an early part of my address yesterday, attributable to him, he wasn't interested in borders, but only in what was described, I think, as nations. The only border, ultimately, that he was interested in, and that he did much to create or to cement, was the border between Serb and non-Serb. He made a point of bringing conflict to the point where the army had to be used. But still Serbia wasn't at war, but he was. He tells us that he was defending his people. They have not asked for his protection. They were not under attack. And Serbia today is again at peace after many years, rebuilding many years of war, or war of a kind, rebuilding its ties with its neighbors. I remind the Chamber of what the prosecutor said about the need to look for individual and not for any kind of overall guilt. It's just the individual guilt of this person with whom we are concerned. And of course, what he did or tried to do was to make his people his unwitting accomplices, who, once drawn into his plans, despite never voting on them, I dare venture to say, could have no escape, or no escape for a long time from the consequences of what he did. What he did at the time in laying plans for the future was, I dare say, that which often happens in crime. And war crimes are crimes. They are things people do knowing that they are acting contrary to law and against the interests of humanity. What they do and what this accused did was to try and dissolve himself away from the picture of events that was developing. Trouble with all that is that dissolve yourself away from the center of events may leave a gap. There may be nobody else left to fill that gap. Nobody else to whom you can point as being responsible for the events that are actually yours. All the events into which this chamber will now have to inquire, will, we submit, point towards a central personality, the existence of a controlling human force. It's a personality the accused seeks to say is not his. But there is no other. And we say, when you've examined all the evidence, that the silhouette of that personality, indeed the full face view of that personality at the center of these events, is unmistakably that of this accused. As with the other indictments, I don't need to review in detail the allegations that are contained in the public indictments. And now, if it's convenient to the Chamber, Mr. Reinveld will deal with the crime-based matters and the evidence relating to that. Unless I can assist you further.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Knight. Mr. Reinveld.
I note the time, Your Honors. I would anticipate that I will be easily done before the end of the next session. I wonder whether you want me to start now and break it, or would you rather take an early break and have me start fresh?
I think if you start now.
Thank you. If it please Your Honors, over half a century ago, Mr. Justice Jackson, the chief prosecutor before the International Military Tribunal, opened the Nuremberg trial with these words: "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." He reflected on the grave responsibility imposed by opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world. At that time, the world hoped that the verdicts in that case would act as a deterrent to future war leaders by having sent the clear message that war crimes and crimes against humanity would be prosecuted according to the rule of law. They hoped that trials of that nature would never be necessary again. Unfortunately, that hope appears to have been in vain. History appears to have repeated itself. The lessons, if learned at all, were either ignored or forgotten. The reign of terror perpetrated by Serb forces during the Milosevic regime in Kosovo has sadly necessitated that today will mark another historic legal first. With this trial, we start the first prosecution of a former sitting head of state of any nation for crimes committed while in office. And it is accordingly an equally grave responsibility to be involved in a trial holding Mr. Milosevic accountable according to the rule of law for the allegations of deportations, forcible transfer, murders, and persecution with which he stands charged in the indictment now before you. The prosecutor of the ICTY, Carla Del Ponte, has given her introductory remarks, and my colleague, Mr. Nice, has already outlined for you an overview of the prosecution's case with respect to all three indictments which have now been joined as one trial. He has also outlined how we intend to prove that Mr. Milosevic is legally responsible and criminally accountable for the acts and omissions of the Serb forces who committed these atrocities. As the senior trial attorney responsible for the Kosovo component of this trial, it is now my duty to outline for you in the balance of the prosecution's opening statement the nature and scope of what we will refer to as the crime-based evidence for Kosovo. In so doing, I hope to give you a thumbnail sketch of what happened during roughly the first 6 months of 1999. This overview is intended to provide the trial chamber with a framework of the Kosovo case. Your Honors, it's the prosecution's submission that the trial before you today is primarily a deportation case. You will hear from witnesses and read in reports and statements that by June of 1999, over 800,000 Kosovo Albanian civilians had been forced from their homes by Serb forces and had to flee to neighboring states. Now, when I say Serb forces, I'm talking about the forces of the FRY, Yugoslavia, the Republic, and of course of the MUP, the police, and certain paramilitary groups. For ease of reference, I'll refer to them as Serb forces. You will see before you on the screen again a map of the Balkans that my learned colleague Mr. Nice also showed. In the process of the 800,000 or so Serbs being forced from their homes, thousands of civilians were murdered. Many of the victims included the elderly as well as women and children. Now, before I go any further, it must be said that there was an armed conflict ongoing in Kosovo between the FRY and Serb forces on the one hand, and the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA, on the other hand. Further, it must be said that in times of armed conflict, it is an unfortunate disturbing, but inescapable fact that people are killed. Undoubtedly, during this particular armed conflict, certain armed combatants from both sides to the conflict were killed as legitimate casualties of war. The fact that people die during times of war does not necessarily signify that a war crime has been committed. That having been said, it must be stressed that is not what this case is about. This case is about persecution in many forms of civilians on a widespread and systematic scale. These acts, when perpetrated against civilian non-combatants, become war crimes and shall be prosecuted pursuant to the jurisdiction of this honorable tribunal. Although the indictment covers the period of the 1st of January 1999 until the 20th of June 1999, it must be remembered that the discriminatory campaign of persecution and expulsion directed at Kosovo Albanians started much earlier. In our pretrial brief, we point to the fact that during certain periods of 1998, similar campaigns had already resulted in the internal displacement of thousands of refugees. According to UNHCR data, which will be introduced at trial, by the end of October 1998, some 285,000 Kosovars had already been internally displaced. This campaign of persecution and expulsion increased in intensity and ferocity towards the end of March 1999, at about the same time that the international monitors were withdrawing from Kosovo. UNHCR staff, nevertheless, continued to monitor the number of refugees crossing at border points throughout Kosovo. Now, their data reflects that by the 30th of March, about 94,000 Kosovars, most of whom were women, children, and older people, had fled Kosovo since the 24th of March, 1999. So we're talking about a one-week period. Many reported deliberate expulsions and destruction of their homes, and many of them didn't know the whereabouts of their men, having been separated from them at the time of the expulsion. You will hear about cumulative daily totals of refugees counted by UNHCR officials. Those reports will show not only the daily tallies of refugees, but will also show that these people reported being forced to leave their homes in freezing temperatures, at night, on foot, some barefoot. Thousands arrived by bus and train, having been gathered together by Serb authorities awaiting expulsion. The report goes on to describe that tens of thousands were on the move inside Kosovo during weather described as freezing and rainy winter conditions, and that several children were reported to have died of dehydration. Finally, this report will indicate that according to UNHCR figures, an estimated 860,000 Kosovars left Kosovo between the 24th of March 1999 and the 10th of June 1999. Now that is what we mean when we say that this case is primarily a deportation case. Undoubtedly, at some time during the course of this trial, the suggestion will be made by Mr. Milosevic or others on his behalf that the reason these people fled Kosovo was because of the NATO bombing and not because of Serb forces' attacks. I want to address that matter right up front during this opening. It is the prosecution's submission that the witnesses will tell you that the vast majority of refugees fled their homes because of the attacks by Serb forces and not because of NATO bombing. You will also have the benefit of the expert report prepared by Dr. Patrick Ball. This report analyzes the data obtained from various sources, including the UNHCR, about refugee movements during the relevant period. In essence, the independent assessment in this report, if accepted by the tribunal, will corroborate the other evidence. Significantly, the analysis suggests that the effects of KLA and NATO activity are inconsistent with the observed patterns of refugee flow and killings. This report, we anticipate, will corroborate what nearly every single witness will tell you. They left because of fear and terror of the advancing Serb troops, and not because of NATO bombing.
Renveld, what if the chamber were to find, as a matter of fact, that they fled because of NATO bombing? Will you be addressing that, the legal position there?
I certainly will later in the address, if I may. Thank you, Your Honor. From the body of evidence you will hear during the course of this trial, it will become patently obvious that the massive refugee movement throughout Kosovo was a direct consequence of the Serb forces. You see, they executed a concerted plan to terrorize the ethnic Albanians into leaving. Villagers would hear the sound of artillery from neighboring villages, see the houses burning, hear horror stories from the fleeing victims, and feared that the same fate awaited them. Consequently, many of them would load their families on carts or tractors or any means of transport available and join the convoy to avoid being beaten, raped, or murdered. The killings, lootings, rapes, and destruction of property were specifically designed to terrorize the population into leaving. It will also become apparent that the architects of this ethnic cleansing campaign took advantage of the onset of NATO bombing to intensify their actions. You will note from the evidence that during the week of the 24th to the 30th of March, Serb forces went on a major killing and deportation spree, intending to blame the deaths and refugee convoys on NATO bombing. The withdrawal of the KVM monitors in anticipation of bombing and the onset of NATO activities gave the Serb forces the perfect opportunity to escalate their campaign and put the blame on others. And that, you will conclude from the evidence we would submit, is exactly what they did. You will hear evidence of mass executions and the systematic process by which Serb forces went from hamlet to hamlet, village to village, town to town, murdering, raping, burning, looting, and destroying property in their path. On the monitor now, you will see two photographs which aren't coming through very clearly. Perhaps if we do them separately. First photograph there we are. First photograph shows what you can see, a burning house with two soldiers standing in front with the three fingers raised. Another photo shows three different soldiers standing again in front of a burning house. This process had the intended effect of frightening the civilian population to leave their homes, their villages, and ultimately their province. The looting and burning had the desired consequence of ensuring that there was nothing for them to return to. You've heard reference to the burning of identification documents. As you can see From the photo now on the Elmo, we see bits of burned passports and identification documents. That was typical of what occurred during this expulsion campaign. In many instances, their attackers told them to leave Kosovo and to go to Albania. You will hear that the Serb forces consistently robbed the refugee of their identity documents and their vehicle license plates. In so doing, they in essence removed all physical evidence that these people had citizen status and prevented them from claiming their legitimate legal and property rights should they attempt to return. All this was done to ensure that they ethnically cleansed the Kosovo Albanians from that province. It will become obvious from the evidence you will hear during the course of this trial that this campaign of deportation and ethnic cleansing occurred throughout Kosovo. The indictment before you, at least with respect to Kosovo, lists some 13 deportation sites and 12 killing or murder sites, some of which overlap. These locations are by no means the only sites where deportations or murders occurred. They are only a representative sample of what actually occurred throughout Kosovo. Before I turn to a discussion of some of the details of the deportation and killing sites contained in the indictment, it may be of some assistance to the trial chamber to refer to the maps of Kosovo depicting those sites. Some of them are already shown by Mr. Nice with some dates on them. These show the first map we now have is the deportation map. You will note that the blue dots representing the villages or towns that will be discussed in the evidence during the course of this trial are not isolated to only one geographical area. Indeed, they cover practically the entire province of Kosovo. This map demonstrates the widespread and systematic nature of the deportation scheme. When one considers that most of these locations were ethnically cleansed in 1 week, between the 24th of March and the 31st of March, it becomes obvious that there was a wholesale and concerted effort by the Serb forces to round up and deport as many Kosovo Albanians as possible in a short time span. The irresistible inference to be drawn from this fact is that this did not occur by happenstance. This was not merely the result of a confluence of coincidences. The evidence you are about to hear will clearly show that this was the result of the coordinated attack by various Serb forces, the Yugoslav Army or VJ and the police or MUP acting in concert. The pattern repeats itself from village to village. This was a planned and deliberate modus operandi on the part of the combined Serb forces carried out throughout Kosovo. That shall become absolutely crystal clear when you hear the evidence. I'm about to turn to the killing site map. Is this an appropriate moment?
Yes.
All right.
1:30.
We
2:30, rather.